You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
How are we doing up there in Connecticut, Mr. Thomas?
We are having a wonderful burst of gorgeous weather. Even though it's early November, it feels like early October. So I was out raking leaves and doing other worthwhile things.
We've had some very nice weather here. It was actually warm on Halloween. Like I was sitting out there sweating a little bit as we're handing out candy to hordes of trick-or-treaters.
Oh, we did the hordes of trick-or-treater thing as well. It rained that night, but fortunately the rain held off until 8 o'clock. So the whole thing goes from 5 p.m. with the littlest kids who were absolutely adorable. We had a lot of first-timers. Little kids, year or 2 years old, out for their first trick-or-treat. We had older kids all the way up to teenagers. And they block off the street with the fire engines, and everybody's up and down the street. And we had some repeat customers because, they go up Maple Avenue one way all the way to the end. There's a whole circuit. And then they come back and we're at the beginning of the route. So that sometimes kids would come by a second time and we didn't care. The whole point is we've got a zillion pieces of candy and we want to put them in the hands of the kids because otherwise Pamela and I will eat them, which is not the goal.
Yeah, same. We typically get hundreds in our neyborhood because people come in from other neighborhoods and park and then have their kids walk up and down the street. We had a couple of families with wagons, one of whom they did family costumes as Jamaican bobsled team.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, we saw some
very cool.
Great costumes this year. We also saw friends of ours who have 2 dogs, both of them older, and one of them, the dog's name is Kisses, isn't walking very well. But they didn't want to leave Kisses at home and miss out on Halloween, so Kisses was riding around in a wagon.
Oh,
so
that's
it was
great.
Very fun. So we saw a lot of people that we know with their kids out and about. You'd see the local teacher and postal worker and all kinds of people that you know from the town, the bank, and their kids and grandkids. And everybody was having such a good time. It was really fun. And I got a lot of laughs out of parents because we had this big basket with candy in it. Of course, I will go out. If I see a group of people walking by, I'll go out to them with show the kids the candy. And then I was encouraging the adults to make a few selections too, because again, at the end of the night, we'd like to have given away as much candy as possible.
Yes. And I'm glad that I was able to go out and sit and hand out candy to trick-or-treaters because I've had the crud, whatever upper respiratory garbage that is not COVID that this is. So I had stayed home from school on Halloween Monday. I felt okay enough to do work, but definitely not enough to go into school and infect everybody that I came across. So I sat down and I'm working, but as I'm working, I'm seeing all these headlines that are true crime related pop up. And I think it must have been around 10 o'clock on Halloween morning. I called you and I was like, oh my God, are you about to watch the Delphi press conference? Because there's another one. They just announced Lady of the Dunes. Can you watch that one too? Like I'm sitting here grading papers, but can you watch that second press conference?
Yeah.
So Halloween Monday was like, this is great.
Yeah, it sure was. So should we jump into it and talk a little bit about what we've learned in the last few days?
Yeah, because there was so much true crime news on Halloween, I called Bill later that day and said, I think we're going to have to do an In Other True Crime News episode because there is so much. And of course, the top breaking story that is on everybody's mind and has been, I think, since last Friday is the arrest of a suspect in the murders of Abby and Libby out of Delphi, Indiana. I am absolutely thrilled that they were finally able to make an arrest in this. And I know you are too, Bill.
We've met Kelsey German, Libby's older sister, several times at CrimeCon, and I even did a podcast with Mike Morford, Kelsey, myself, and several advocates. It's got to be a couple of years ago now.
Okay, that was 2019.
So we're thrilled that we've seen an arrest here, and Kelsey has put out a number of kind of just brief social media comments, but those families have been saying today is the day for 5.5 years, and then finally that day has come. There's a couple of dates worth talking about here in the Delphi arrest. The actual arrest of suspect Richard Matthew Allen took place on Wednesday, October 26th, 2022. A news story broke on the local Fox affiliate out of Indianapolis on Friday the 28th. That was followed by an announcement that there would be a press conference the following Monday morning. So as you were mentioning, Kristin, that would have been Halloween morning, if there is such a thing. Richard Allen, who goes by Ricky, is a local man. He lives in Delphi. He's 50 years old. He's married. He is a registered pharmacist and works at CVS in Delphi. Delphi is a relatively small town. There's only one CVS. He is someone who prepared prescriptions, but also ran the register and spoke with people. He's well known in the community. He is quiet, sticks to himself, been married for a number of years. He and his wife, Kathy, have 2 kids. He doesn't seem like a likely suspect, if there is such a thing, for a horrific murder of this type. He lives in Delphi in a kind of a modest suburban tract house, only a couple of miles away from the bridge where the girls went hiking. That would have been in February 2017. It's been 5.5 years since them itself. I mapped out where he lives. He also lives just a couple of miles from CVS, which is in downtown Delphi. It's one of those situations where Richard Allen would have literally been under everyone's nose. This pharmacy is located a half a block from the courthouse. The police officers working this case probably would have been in and out of that store frequently. They, like almost every other business in town, had posters of Bridge Guy, as they referred to him. Both sketches. We have an older sketch and a younger sketch that were developed and still never completely adequately explained from my point of view. VS was just like almost every other business in town that had those posters up with information about Libby and Abby and the circumstances of their murder, as well as the 2 sketches. One of the things I saw online, which was quite chilling, it looked like he and his wife were out at a local pub or something. He's smiling and leaning back in his chair. And if you look carefully behind him on the wall, this is in this restaurant or bar, there's the sketch of the man they're looking for, which would be him. There are some frustrations that a number of us felt in terms of the press conference itself. It wasn't very informative.
Exactly.
And given the level of hype, and I'm not saying that hype is the fault of the Indiana State Police, I actually found the press conference disappointing because they didn't provide a lot of information. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying they had to give us everything, but they gave us almost nothing that we didn't already know from the local television coverage that had hit the previous Friday. Part of my criticism is that you have to understand, this is what I did for a living. I ran public events. I did senior level communications. I've run a lot of press conferences. And I find these press conferences run by the Indiana State Police to be not very well run. They're very frustrating in that they're making mistakes that I can't believe they're making. For example, when they go to questions, most of us are not in the room. Most of us are somewhere else in the world. And people are watching this literally all over the world. They actually said the town of Delphi was struggling with available bandwidth. There was so much interest in this case across the country and around the world. And media people had traveled there from all over the country. For those of us that were not in the room, one of the most frustrating things for me was they went to questions, which they refused to answer, basically one question after another, but we couldn't hear the questions. And this is the second time I've watched a Delphi press conference. There was one a few years ago. They did the exact same thing. Either the person running the press conference needs to repeat the question, because those of us that are watching on television, listening on the radio, watching on the World Wide Web, whatever it is, we can't hear the question. And then obviously they're refusing to answer question after question. Yeah. So it's one of those things where they either have to have a microphone and allow people to step up, or they can pass around a wireless mic, or the person moderating who's supposed to be answering the questions needs to repeat the questions. But I found myself dumbfounded watching this press conference, which was very light on information. And then we get to the questions. And I know people said later, and I'm talking about people who are supporters of the families and want to see this case moved forward, as we all do. They were criticizing the media for breaking off after a certain point and not covering the press conference. But from the perspective of a television station or whatever, why would you keep showing a press conference where you can't hear the questions and they're refusing to answer them? There's no point. You're actually wasting everyone's time. We did learn a few things. We did learn that Richard Matthew Allen has been charged with 2 counts of murder. We know that's the case. We know that there's a preliminary hearing set for January 2023, and then a tentative trial date of March 2023. Now, I have my doubts that this trial will actually move forward in March. That seems pretty fast to me for a murder. Interestingly, they've only scheduled 5 days for the murder trial. Mr. Allen has pled not guilty.
Okay.
So this isn't going to be a quick process. He's obviously going to contest the charges. There were a lot of other questions from the media, both at the press conference and afterward, most of which they've refused to answer. Interestingly, they did say that they're leaving the tip line open. I was watching criminal profiler Pat Brown comment about this case. She didn't think there was anything that significant about that. She just thought that they always want to be open in case there's any new information out there that might help add to their strong prosecution. Obviously, they want to have as much information and as much evidence as possible. That was pretty much all we learned. I was actually very frustrated in that I actually thought everything I just summarized for you, those 4 or 5 points, that could have been sent out in a press release. It wasn't really necessary to have people travel in from all over the country and for people to tune in from all over the world to hear something that was very simple and tight. I have seen a significant amount of discussion amongst media people who obviously want to cover this case and get into the details, who have been a little thrown off by the fact that the charging document, which has a sworn affidavit, has a good deal of information, is sealed. That's pretty unusual. Usually in a situation like this, the documents are public. And some people are a bit troubled by that. And I probably would put myself on that side of the spectrum.
Sure.
I'm not trying to criticize law enforcement or just point out the faults of what's happening. This is fantastic news. We're thrilled for the community of Delphi and especially for the families of Libby and Abby. It will be very satisfying to see this long 5.5-year process. It'll be 6 years by the time it gets to trial. It will be very satisfying to see this thing move forward, and fingers crossed. I think they've identified the right man. Many of us are wondering how he was identified, but I think we're going to have to wait till trial to find out more.
I think so. Yeah, I remember calling you on the day that we learned that there had been an arrest in the Delphi case. And I asked you, I don't know if you were surprised by what I'd asked or not. I'd asked you, does it feel bittersweet for you to know that there's been an arrest made in a case when it has been so long coming for an arrest in your sister's case?
And my response was and remains, It's exactly the opposite. It feels great because those of us that have lived waiting for answers in our loved ones' cases can completely understand some of what the families are going through. I had said to Kelsey on that podcast that we did with Mike Morford a few years ago, I don't want you to be me 30 years from now. She's in her early 20s now. She just graduated from college. She just got married. She's a wonderful person and just an amazing young woman. I'm thrilled that she doesn't have to wait 35 years for answers. 5 years is a long time. This has been very difficult for their families and for the community of Delphi. I get why you asked the question, but no, I am just over the moon. I think this is fantastic.
This is wonderful. And we're so pleased that at least someone in the true crime space that we all inhabit, I was going to call us a true crime family. That feels a little weird. But at the same time, I also feel like maybe it's apt just a little bit. I'm so glad that she and all of those affected by Abby and Libby's murders are finally able to get some answers and start that process moving forward. We have both said before that we don't like the term closure because there really is no such thing as closure, but at least it feels like they can move toward putting this chapter in the rearview mirror. Although I imagine that Kelsey will continue to do her advocacy work.
Oh, I think so too. She's gone on now and she's gotten a degree in criminology. I think she's going to end up being a leader in this field without question. There are a number of open issues that I think it'll be very interesting to see how they shake out. I was watching a video with Ken Maines, the wonderful investigator, and he's been the president of ASOC, the organization of cold case investigators, very smart guy and a really fine investigator. And he raised a couple of points on a video I was watching over the weekend before the press conference. He had said he thought there was a strong possibility that this recent arrest of Richard Allen could be related to the fact that Keegan Kline is headed for trial. And those of you that have been following the case may remember that Keegan Kline and his father are two sleazeballs who are involved in a catfishing effort trying to lure young girls into exchanging explicit photographs, and they engage in all sorts of really horrific images of child porn, exploitation of minors, horrible stuff. And Kline's son, Keegan Kline, and his father were both identified pretty early on in the first week or two of the investigation as potentially having had contact with Libby and Abby. Kline was using a photograph of a male model and presenting that as himself. Trust me, Kline looks anything not like a male model. He has been headed for a trial date, which is coming up soon. He was recently taken into police custody, and Ken Maines thinks that could be significant. There was also a search of the Wabash River near Keegan Kline's home in Peru, Indiana, and Kline lives fairly close to a bridge, which was central to an extensive law enforcement search. They had divers there. From the photographs and video I saw, it looked like this would have been a month or so back.
Okay.
They were bare-chested, so the water was warm enough so that they're wearing wetsuits, but it didn't look like it was extremely cold yet. And apparently one of the things that they may have been searching for was possibly a weapon that might have been thrown off that bridge. Richard Allen is a licensed gun owner. He does own a handgun. And there was a possibility, there were some rumors that there might have been a knife or other essential evidence may have been thrown off the bridge. Ken Maines also makes the point that he thinks there's still a possibility there may be DNA. In this case, they've never said publicly whether there is or is not DNA in the Libby and Abby case. I think this is a strong possibility. And one of the things that people have mentioned is the possibility that, once again, investigative genetic genealogy may have played a role here. Yeah. If, for example, it's doubtful that Richard Allen, who doesn't appear to have any priors, he's not going to be in the CODIS system for previous offenses. There might be an attempt to link DNA to individuals through forensic genetic genealogy. It'll be very interesting to see where this all goes. One other suspect whose name has been mentioned a number of times is property owner Ron Logan. He actually owned the property where the girls' remains were found. He died of COVID over the last couple of years. He had lied about his whereabouts and had a record, but he was never charged by law enforcement. It's hard to say whether Logan may have actually been involved or not. I think they would have taken steps to bring him in earlier if they thought that Logan was involved. There's been a lot of frustration surrounding this case and a lot of stops and starts. One of the reasons why law enforcement may be so careful about sharing the charging document is they were significantly embarrassed. Earlier this year, a true crime podcast had located documents regarding Keegan Kline and that part of the investigation, which were briefly on an unsecured location in a law enforcement website. Unfortunately, the podcast made the really questionable decision to leak those documents. I think that's a poor choice and could actually damage this prosecution, which may be one of the reasons why law enforcement is so closed-mouthed about the charging document and other important legal documents regarding Richard Allen. I understand the sensitivity because at the end of this process, the prosecution is looking for a guilty result here. They're looking for a conviction. I think all of us in the podcast space and in media in general have to be aware of the fact that we need to be careful. I know we are all intensely curious people. We want to know what's going on. We want to be able to discuss it, report on it. But leaking documents that you've acquired as a result of a minor glitch by a court officer, I think it's very questionable. As interesting as it is to read the Keegan Kline charging documents, it's not probably particularly helpful and probably has added to the kind of bunker mindset that many of the people on this Delphi task force are feeling. They're just being assaulted by so many media inquiries. Law enforcement and the media have sometimes a contentious relationship. They also need each other and can help each other. Understandable how frustrated law enforcement and now the prosecutors have been by the unfortunate leaks in the Delphi case.
I know that our friends at the FBI are not 100% thrilled that you have a podcast and like to talk about our case on it on the regular.
Yes, and they've said so. And my attitude is I'll keep asking questions until they move our case forward. I think there's a balance, like most things in life.
I agree with you 100%. And I do agree that is some morally dubious ground that podcast was willing to traverse there. And that's just not something that is not something that I feel is appropriate at all. We're going to look forward to more updates from our friends at Delphi. And we hope nothing but the best for Kelsey and all of the families and friends of Abby and Libby moving forward. And as we continue to get more information about the Delphi case, we will continue to keep you all apprised on it.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. And speaking of, there was another major story this week.
There was. The timing on this one was interesting, too, because we had just talked to Casey Sherman a couple of episodes ago about his wonderful book, Helltown. And at the end of Helltown, he did mention the Lady of the Dunes case, which at the time that I read the book, I was not familiar with. Bill, as a Massachusetts native, had you heard of Lady of the Dunes?
I had. I knew the basics about the case, and I had talked to Lance and Tim of the Crawl Space and Missing podcasts, and that was a case that they were very interested in. They're both from the Boston. It's an interesting case, and it's considered Massachusetts' longest unidentified remains case in terms of a murder victim going without a name.
So when, in the midst of my grading on Monday, I stopped to check Facebook, as one does. I noticed that Casey Sherman had posted a link to an article from a Boston affiliate that announced a press conference that would be happening an hour after the Delphi conference, announcing that they had finally identified the Lady of the Dunes. At which point I made a phone call to you and said, oh my God, while you're watching press conferences, can you switch over and find this one? Because I was wading my way through papers, as one does on one's sick day. Can't sit there and take a nap. I got to grade this stuff. I was actually pretty thrilled that almost immediately you sent back a very nice statement from the FBI. They did a great job on this statement, by the way. It gave so much information. And that statement talked about who the Lady of the Dunes was. We're burying the lead here, but the murder victim, who has long been known as the Lady of the Dunes, has finally been identified. And her name is Ruth Marie Terry, 37. And because I noticed not a lot of the reporting has said this so far, I want to go ahead and give props where props are due. This is thanks to our friends at Othram. They did the work on this.
Like in a lot of these announcements, the labs take a back seat. They want to put the victims and the law enforcement agencies up front. I know we reached out to Othram, and we'll be talking with Othram in the near future about the work they did.
Yes.
And they confirmed to us privately initially.
Yes.
Later they went public, but they wanted to wait until after the press conference.
Yeah, I reached out to Kristin Middleman and I was like, did you guys do this? And she was like, yeah, but give me like another 10 minutes before you post anything about it. Because she wanted to launch it on her site first, which, like, yes, absolutely. This is beyond the beyond that they managed to do this. What an incredible effort on their part. And as Bill mentioned, we are going to get Kristin and David on to talk about what had to have been some very tough sleuthing on their part to locate the information about Ruth Marie Terry. Let's go ahead and get a little bit into Ruth Marie Terry. So she was 37 years old at the time of her death. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with Lady of the Dunes, just a quick sketch. She was found in the dunes outside of Cape Cod in July of 1974. It was a pretty brutal scene. She was missing her hands, which made identification really impossible for quite a while, 48 years. Her head was nearly severed from her body. It was a truly brutal and awful scene. No one seemed to have missed this person. No one seemed to have missed her. And for years and years and years, she went unidentified. People had their pet theories. The New York Times article that I was reading mentioned Joe Hill, who's Stephen King's son. Joe Hill's pet theory is that the Lady of the Dunes was an extra from Jaws that was shooting in the area that summer, and mentioned that maybe she's an extra who was murdered in between scenes on the movie. Fanciful idea, it'd be a cool urban legend, but that is not the case.
And apparently one of the things that Joe Hill had done is, in watching Jaws, he noticed a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Ruth, who also goes by Terry. She is one of these people with multiple names. And there was a woman with bright red hair, beautiful auburn hair, and bright blue eyes that looked an awful lot like Ruth. So he just ran with this idea. Could it have been someone who came to the Cape and the islands that summer to work on Jaws? Because remember, there were hundreds of extras, background performers who were brought in. Many of them are from around the country, who worked on the movie, and they would have been pretty transient. In other words, come in, work for a couple of months, and then be gone. Because one of the mysteries about this case has always been, as you said, Kristin, why isn't anyone missing her?
Yes. The FBI statement initially just identified Ruth Marie Terry as, they identified her as a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a wife, and a mother. But they didn't give much beyond that. And for a couple of days, we didn't have more than that. Today, when I was doing research for this episode, I noticed the New York Times had released some brand new reporting, and the plot has thickened here quite a bit with regard to Ruth Marie Terry. The initial FBI statement listed her as daughter, sister, aunt, wife, mother. They stated that she had ties to Tennessee, where she was born, also to Michigan, to California, and to Massachusetts. Today, the New York Times released that she had two AKAs, also known as Terry Marie Vizina, I think is how you say it, and then Terry Shannon. Now, a couple of hours ago, investigators released that they are seeking information regarding the movements and location of her husband at the time of her death. And for me, that was the first time I'd heard a name associated with him. So the husband's name is Guy Rockwell. I think Moldovan is how you say it.
I would go with Moldovan, but...
Moldovan. Okay. All right. You tend to be better at that than I am. Guy Rockwell Moldovan. He's also known as Raoul Guy Moldovan and Guy Moldovan Rockwell. So a couple of different variations on there. She had married him in February 1974, which is only a couple of months before she was murdered. This guy is a bit of an unsavory character. He was arrested in 1960 in the deaths of his ex-wife and her daughter.
This is
Seattle, Washington.
This is a previous marriage now.
This is a previous marriage. He was arrested on suspicion that he had murdered his ex-wife and her daughter when their mutilated remains were found in their family home.
It gets a little worse because they were in the septic system. Again, we have to remember this is pre-DNA by a wide margin back in the early 60s. So the remains are found, but they don't know who it is. And amazingly, he is only briefly charged.
Yes. And so he received a suspended sentence of probably killing his wife and daughter. By 1962, he's out, footloose, fancy-free, and able to marry again. And I don't know, not much of a detective or anything like that, Bill, but I have to wonder if maybe he murdered his second wife as well.
What's amazing, too, is that the early newspaper reporting, which some of the researchers are finding now, this goes back to the early 60s again, they describe him as a bunco artist, B-U-N-C-O, which is a word I hadn't seen in years. It's an old-fashioned expression. It's a really great word. A bunco artist is a con artist. And
I thought you were going to say it's an actual form of art.
No, a bunco artist
is a con artist?
Is a con artist, someone that runs scams. He's described as an antiques dealer, but
what does that even mean?
Also described as a con artist. He was involved in numerous cons, including stealing $10,000 from his second wife's family. And then ultimately, and somehow again he skates, he was caught, but law enforcement and prosecutors said, if you return the money, we won't file charges. And apparently that's what he did. Apparently, he's known as a guy who was married multiple times and then had many love interests around the country.
Oh, my God.
And he's involved in all of these scams. The guy is a career criminal on some level, but he's also considered very charming. And then some of the newspaper articles say he had a reputation for being an amazing lover. And what? This guy is a complete sleazebag. And
oh, wow.
He's suspected of killing his first wife and child. He ripped off the second wife's family for $10,000, ultimately returned in order to keep himself out of jail. And now it looks like he may be linked to this horrific murder on Cape Cod of his third wife, Terry.
The bunco artist is no longer with us. He did die in Salinas, California in 2002. So there's no chance of an arrest in this case. But yeah, authorities are now very interested in if you happen to know what this guy was doing in 1974, can you please call and let us know? Yeah, I was very moved and touched when I read the New York Times reporting on this case, because they did talk about the fact that she had a son named Richard, it looks like Hanchett, who was 64. He spent a lot of years hearing stories about his mother and how she was beautiful and had red hair and blue eyes and loved to sing. He unfortunately was never able to meet her. She had him adopted out after he was born in 1958. She actually turned him over to a couple who worked with her at a factory that made like door panels and seat covers for cars in Michigan. So she was 21 at the time that she had him, and she adopted him out. And so he never met his mother. But in 2018, he decided to start looking for her, hoping that he could connect with her. He did what so many people who are looking for missing relatives have done, which is he took a DNA test through Ancestry, and he ultimately met her family in Tennessee. At that point, he learned that his biological mother had been missing since the early 70s and that her relatives had been looking for her. And so the story starts for the New York Times when they say the family finally learned after all these years that here she is, this badly mutilated body that was found in the dunes in Provincetown all those years ago. He talked about the fact that he was never able to meet his biological mother. She had reached out to him at one point, but he'd rejected the overtures because he wasn't ready to meet her. And he said it's a regret that he carries with him that he never reached back out and was never able to connect with her. So it did say that he is hoping to have her body, which is currently in Massachusetts, brought back to Tennessee so that he can bury her next to her parents.
I hope Mr. Hanchett won't be too hard on himself. As we were reading these articles, it looked like he was 13 years old when she reached out to him. And I can imagine that would be very difficult to be a young teen and have your birth mom reach out to you and maybe try to make a connection. But at that point, you've been raised by this other family, and he probably felt like she had rejected him back when he was a baby. And you could see how that would be very difficult for him.
Yeah.
I understand the regret, but I hope that he can find a way to his own peace in all of this. He had no way of knowing that this was going to happen just a few years later. If she was 21 when she gave him up and he was about 13 when she reached out, that would have only been a few years before her death.
Yeah, it's how interesting is it that, as you were saying off air earlier, now that we have a name for her, suddenly all these puzzle pieces start clicking into place.
Exactly.
And we start learning more about the ne'er-do con artist husband who probably killed one wife and definitely conned another, and now it's entirely possible he killed his third. Very interesting the way that giving somebody their name back makes all of these other pieces of a puzzle, or I guess maybe more like a kaleidoscope, shift into place. I think that's very interesting. And I certainly hope that even though he is no longer alive and cannot face justice, I hope that more answers do come out about what happened to her and the full circumstances of how she ended up in the dunes. It was interesting looking back at the end of Helltown because Casey had his own theory about Lady of the Dunes. Now his theory does not seem to be the one that he had posited in the book. He had posited that it was one of Tony Costa's, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. Harem girl isn't quite polite. That's not what I'm looking for, but one of Tony Costa's little girlfriends, that's not polite either, but you know what I'm saying, may have actually murdered her. It was an interesting theory, but I'm glad that we have an actual answer here for who Ruth Marie Terry actually is. And I'm hoping that they find out more about the circumstances of her death so that her family has some additional answers.
There's been so much interest in this case over the years, and just in recent times, this is before the discovery, there's already a documentary that's in production and is supposed to be coming out next year. I'm sure they'll be adding some new scenes here. And the Cape Cod Times did a series of podcasts on the Lady of the Dunes case, and hopefully they'll be adding some new episodes now that we have a name associated with this longstanding case. It's an amazing story. And I remember when we were talking with Casey about it, both the primary Tony Costa story that Casey told in Helltown and this case, they are so amazing. It's actually one of those situations where we were both saying truth truly is stranger than fiction.
It really is. So these are two cases that we're thrilled to see coming towards some form of conclusion here. We have a lot more true crime news that we would like to break down and discuss. So we're going to pull this into a second episode, I think. Bill, do you have any closing thoughts for us today?
I'm thrilled about the developments in both the Delphi and Cape Cod cases. I'm also just so tickled to see Bunko Artist back in common usage. I have no idea about the origin of bunco. We'll have to look that one up.
Oh, yeah.
I think what's so pivotal in the Lady of the Dunes case, as you were saying, Kristin, now that we know who she is and we have some information about her, just in the last couple of days, there's just been this explosion of additional information coming out about her. We've heard about a son. We heard about a nephew. We've heard about a sister. Some of these people are alive. A few of these people who are on the older side are gone now. And now we have this bunco artist husband. There's so much more to this story. It's going to be very interesting. And I'm thrilled that Ruth has her name back.
Absolutely. We're going to continue with other true crime news for another episode. But for right now, we're signing off for this one. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.